Yes. So I will now give some instances of the kind of problems that result from the structure of PIL. The examples I take are from Delhi actually, and from what's been going on in the name of PIL in the last 35 years in the city. Now, Delhi has for long been kind of a laboratory for PIL. Some of the most interventionist measures by the court has been in this city. Um, Probably the most well-known of them are the so-called MC Mehta cases on transport as well as on pollution. Now, interestingly, these cases are still on. Started in 1985, so 36 years already gone, and there's no end in sight. In fact, the notorious Justice Arun Mishra, who retired a few months back, his infamous last order of ordering the demolition of 400,000 slums and railway land was also in one of the MC Mehta cases. So this is an interesting process. This case was initiated by one man, but this man has had nothing to do with this litigation for the longest time, for decades now. I call this a PI with 9 lives because, it started with one cause of action, that is about pollution caused by stone crushing units. Then it moved to another cause of action, that is river pollution. Then it became to another cause of action, that is encroachments in the rich forest, then to another, then to another, then to another. So, it normally when we designate a case, when we give a name to a case, we normally refer to by the name of the cause title, that is the petitioner versus X versus Y, or by the cause it's dealing with, the cause of action. But both are inappropriate in this case because the petitioner has had nothing to do with this case for decades. And secondly, the cause of action has kept changing, right? So it's a strange beast, this kind of a case. It's a case where the court can deal with whatever issue it deems fit in this empty shell, 46771985. So I think the only way to describe it is by this number. This case becomes whatever it wants as the court wants it to be. Now, this case has actually not just the fact that it's the nature keeps changing, make it a strange beast, but also the fact that this case has actually single-handedly changed the nature of the city of Delhi. This case is the one through which all the major industries were shut down in 1996. Large parts of West Delhi had industries, most famous being the Birla Mills, etc. In the western part of the city, they were all closed down in the name of pollution. And the workers who, the lakhs of workers who used to work there were not actually given any compensation for losing their employment. And the owners were actually very happy with this closure because they were able to sell this land, which was given to them as industrial land for a very, very low price. They were able to sell it as commercial land and make huge profits. So the only people who lost out were actually the workers, who suddenly were left with no job, etc. And again, like we saw in the Noria Kone case, that happened in 2009. But 13 years before that, 1996, already in this case, when the attempts were made by the trade unions and by the workers' organizations to intercede in this case, to present their point of view, they were not heard. And these factories were closed in 1996. In 2000, they proceeded from the so-called hazardous industries, which were closed in 1996, to the non-conforming industries, that is, industries that did not comply with the zoning laws. So those large numbers of them were also closed down in 2000, between 2000 and 2005. And then it led to the next phase, which is called the so-called sealing phase. If anybody lived in Delhi during this period between 2006 and 2009, this used to dominate the headlines in the city at the time. But the court decided to close down all commercial establishments which were in residential areas, etc. So all the initially they were closing down hazardous industries and non-conforming industries, that is industries that violate the zoning laws. Now they started closing down the, um, the commercial entities, which also existed in residential areas. So zoning law violation. Now, anybody familiar with the nature of Delhi would know that compliance with zoning laws and laws in such a strict manner of not having commercial establishments and shops in residential areas that only happens in very posh areas. Almost everywhere else, it's a melange of mix of commercial and residential and even industrial, etc. Right? But anyway, the court's imagination was to clean up all of this corruption, and this led to havoc, and many thousands of people lost their jobs, and this led to a huge amount of upheaval. And eventually, after a great amount of uncertainty, the case kind of petered down. And some version of it from time to time comes up again. But this is a strange case which tried to, in a sense, remake the city of Delhi, and it significantly did by basically destroying, almost all industry that existed here. Many of you familiar with the history of Bombay would know that factories that closed down there largely because of, as a result of this the famous textile strike of the early 80s, like the Saman. The mill area basically, now increasingly basically commercial and residential areas. In Delhi, deindustrialization also happened, but not through a kind of labor unrest, etc., but through the court, through the judicial intervention. So the move from a somewhat manufacturing to a kind of a service industry-oriented city was facilitated by the judicial intervention. Another very important intervention that happened through PIL in this period, especially between in the first decade of the 21st century, really, we saw almost 1 million people being evicted from their houses in the so-called slums over this period. And this was largely through PIL. The only other period in which such massive slum demolition happened in the city before was during the emergency, of course. Now, PIL enabled a similar kind of intervention. Most governments are not able to carry out such mass evictions unless they are completely unaccountable, like the emergency government, or if under the judicial garb that PIL could take. Now, the interesting thing about these cases, and not only the fact that you and I may not be very happy with the results, but the nature of the process was such that people directly affected were not made a party to the case, right? So, so another key, like we discussed about locus standi and about evidence, another key part of litigation, one of the key principles of civil procedure, is that anybody who is directly affected by litigation should be made a party to the case. That is, if I have any interest, if I'm in any way is concerned by a cause of action, they have to be heard. It's called the principle of necessary and proper parties. That has been departed with fundamentally, repeatedly, again and again in PIL. We saw with the tribal community of Dongria Kong, we saw with the factory workers, and we see it with in the slum demolitions most evidently, that this would repeatedly happen. These slums would be demolished without even hearing the people who would live in these colonies. And the interesting thing to counterpose is to compare it with an early piece, so-called PIL, from the early phase when things had not become so random in terms of court procedure. So a particular middle-class organization went to court in Ahmedabad, High Court, arguing against the nuisance caused by defecation by slum in the neighborhood. Now, the court rejected this petition on 2 grounds. One, that they had not made slum dwellers a party. They had to be made a party. And secondly, there were questions of fact involved. which the High Court in the writ jurisdiction could not adjudicate. Now, such technical and important procedural issues were no longer relevant, were no longer deemed fit to be seen as objections in PIL cases by the early 21st century, and the wrath of the court in that it would display towards slums were undiminished by any procedural protections that the people might have had. And here it could deploy its full procedural flexibility that it had honed to perfection. For instance, we saw with the Mukti Morcha case the question of evidence being diluted. So in these cases, for instance, often there would be allegations that this basti, are doing all kinds of illegal activities. And there would be some random photos of, defecation again by people living in slums, or them having televisions or even air conditioners. And that would be deemed as evidence enough that the court would go ahead and order demolitions. And of course, the thing is that we normally assume that most of these cases were led by middle-class organizations who made allegations against slums in their neighborhood, and that kind of class warfare was made possible by PIL. But it's even worse than that, actually, because soon, by a certain stage in early 2000s, the court decided there were too many of these RWA cases against slums. Instead, it decided to combine them all into one case, and decided to appoint its own commissioners for each municipal area, so that all illegal settlements could be demolished. So this was during this period in 2004, 2005, perfection of this kind of demolition drive through PIL that was made possible. The largest of these demolitions was for the Yamuna Pushta one. That was the largest slum cluster in Delhi. This was demolished in 2004. Again, it's a very interesting example to understand, because this case had actually nothing to do with Yamuna Pushta. This was a case that initially arose from, two middle-class organizations in Wazirpur in North Delhi and Okhla in Southeast Delhi, filing writs against slums in their neighborhood. But the court decided to expand the remit of the case and suo motu enlarge it to make it about all settlements and all slums near the river, the Yamuna. So therefore, they said that any settlement within a few hundred meters of the Yamuna had to be removed, and this was apropos of nothing. I mean, nobody had come to them before it. So they were the petition. So the court basically took it up and made up its own facts and appointed its own amicus and ordered its own remedy, which is demolition. And the Yamuna Pushta, which had more than 200,000 people living there, was demolished under the court's order in 2004. So this is the kind of thing that PIL makes possible, right? That all the ordinary limitations of judicial process is no longer available to litigants who may be adversely affected by it.